August 1945. The Empire of Japan surrenders, ending the Second World War and its 40-year rule over the Korean Peninsula. Korea is subsequently divided between the United States and the Soviet Union along the 38th parallel, creating two administrative zones. August 1948. As tensions escalate during the Cold War, negotiations on reunification fail, and these zones become two separate sovereign states, North Korea and South Korea. Between 1948 and 1950, border tensions, including raids and guerrilla warfare, result in thousands of deaths for both sides. June 1950. North Korean military forces are now augmented by nearly 60,000 veterans from the Chinese Civil War. The Soviet Union supplies heavy weaponry, including artillery, tanks, bombers, and fighter aircraft. Soviet military personnel with extensive combat experience from the Second World War, who were sent to North Korea as an advisory group, have already assisted in planning an invasion. 25th of June 1950, a North Korean combined arms force crosses the 38th parallel behind artillery fire. South Korean forces, lacking tanks, heavy artillery, or effective anti-tank weapons, are forced to withdraw. In less than 4 days, the capital of South Korea, Seoul, is captured. The United Nations Security Council condemns the North Korean invasion and recommends military assistance be provided to South Korea. 7th of July 1950, a multinational military force is established, the world's first attempt at a collective security intervention under Chapter 7 of the newly formed United Nations Charter. Known as United Nations Command, over the course of the Korean War, 22 nations will contribute to the US-led operation. Over 17,000 Australians will serve in the Korean War, with 340 paying the ultimate price. September 1950. UN forces retreat to a small corner on the Korean peninsula, known as the Pusan Perimeter. Chinese forces deployed along the North Korean border now number nearly 260,000. However, North Korean supply lines are now stretched, whilst UN forces receive ongoing naval resupply, including 500 battle-ready tanks. On the 15th of September 1950, under the command of US General Douglas MacArthur, UN forces conduct an amphibious landing at Incheon. 2 days later, UN forces break out from the Pusan perimeter. 11 days later, UN forces recapture Seoul. 28th of September 1950, 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, arrives in Pusan and joins the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade. Australian forces now committed to the Korean War also include No. 77 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force and 2 Royal Australian Navy vessels, HMAS Shoalhaven and HMAS Bataan. October 1950. UN forces cross the 38th parallel. With minimal opportunity to train and prepare, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Green, 3 RAR distinguishes itself during combat in the vanguard of the UN advance into North Korea. With UN forces now approaching the Chinese border, the President of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Mao Zedong, responds. And on the 19th of October 1950, Chinese forces begin crossing the Yalu River. Under the cover of nightfall and undetected, China enters the war. Having advanced through the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, 3 RAR makes it as far north as Chongchu, where for the first time, Australian and Chinese forces engage in combat. On the 30th of October 1950, Lieutenant Colonel Green is wounded by shrapnel from a high-velocity shell and dies 2 days later in a mobile Army surgical hospital. He remains the only commanding officer of a battalion from the Royal Australian Regiment to die on active service. The war now enters a new phase. 300,000 Chinese soldiers now advance south, driving back UN forces, and on the 4th of January 1951, Seoul is recaptured. 3 RAR, as part of the UN rearguard, is the last unit to leave Seoul via the railway bridge across the Han River before it is destroyed by US Army engineers. With UN forces continuing to withdraw, the Chinese advance south now begins to slow due to logistical difficulties. Targeted by the superior US Air Force, Chinese supply lines are now stretched and vulnerable, with resupply only conducted at night using pack animals, bicycles, and on foot. UN forces are able to push north again, and on the 14th of March 1951, UN forces recapture Seoul, the fourth and final time the South Korean capital will be conquered. April 1951. The forces of United Nations Command continue to advance, driving Chinese and North Korean forces north of the 38th parallel. The advance initially meets little opposition until 700,000 Chinese soldiers counterattack, smashing into the UN line on what is now known as the Chinese Spring Offensive. Near the centre of the UN line, along a key invasion corridor which leads directly to Seoul, lies Kapyong Valley. With the UN line in general retreat, nearly 20,000 Chinese soldiers advance down Kapyong Valley, intent on breaking through the UN Central Front and recapturing the South Korean capital. The formation that will stand in their way is the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, which includes 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment. This is the story of the Battle of Kapyong and the vital role 3 RAR played in protecting Seoul from communist forces. On the evening of 22nd of April 1951, at the northern end of Kapyong Valley, South Korea's 6th Division is almost immediately overwhelmed. Withdrawing in disorder, they abandon vehicles, weapons, and equipment. This chaotic retreat endangers the supporting British Infantry and New Zealand artillery units, who are now also forced to retreat south. 23rd of April 1951. Fearing a Chinese breakthrough, the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade is ordered to establish defensive positions at Kapyong to delay the Chinese advance on Seoul for as long as possible. Under the command of British Brigadier Brian Burke, the 27th Brigade deploys along a 6-kilometre front, creating 2 battalion defensive positions on either side of Kapyong Valley. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, 3 RAR occupies Hill 504 in the east, while 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, occupies Hill 677 to the southwest. 27th Brigade headquarters is located 4 kilometres further south. Critically, due to the large amount of ground required to be defended and the brigade being comprised of only 3 battalions, units were unable to offer mutual support. The 27th Brigade is supported by 15 Sherman tanks from Alpha Company, US 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion, and 1 company from the US 2nd Chemical Mortar Battalion. Upon Hill 504, Delta Company, 3 RAR, occupies the summit itself, with Alpha Company to the west, Charlie Company in reserve, and Bravo Company all the way across the valley on an isolated feature called the Island. With 3 RAR Battalion headquarters 2 kilometres to the south, in total, around 700 Australians defend Kapyong Valley. Australian forces spend the cold spring afternoon in rocky terrain, preparing defensive positions as the South Korean retreat turns from a trickle into a flood. South Korean soldiers and panicked civilian refugees flee southwards along the valley floor, running between the Australian positions. Australian forces now lie directly in the path of nearly 20,000 advancing Chinese soldiers, and it's around this time that communications begin to fail between battalion headquarters and the forward company positions. As night begins to fall, Chinese advance elements infiltrate and open fire on battalion headquarters. Chinese infiltrators now engage the US Mortar Company. Withdrawing from their position, the American mortarmen take only their individual weapons, leaving behind their mortars and trucks full of ammunition. 23rd of April 1951, 21:30 hours. Now aided by the light of a full moon, Chinese forces launch their first attack against the US tanks which are operating independently, forward of the Australian Bravo Company position. Despite lacking infantry support, the US tanks engage, inflicting heavy casualties in a target-rich environment. Chinese forces now seek to bypass by moving to the high ground on the side of Kapyong Valley, where they run directly into Alpha Company 3 RAR. Chinese infantry charge forward in wave after wave, only to be beaten back by grenades, machine gun and rifle fire. Close quarters combat commences. After each assault, Chinese officers can be heard regrouping their men by whistle blasts, before the next attack is launched by bugle call, seemingly without any regard for the growing piles of Chinese bodies in front of the Australian positions. New Zealand artillery, still withdrawing south in order to secure new battery gun lines, provides only intermittent fire support. Under the command of Major Ben O'Dowd, Alpha Company 3 RAR now faces major Chinese assaults from three sides. Against a numerically superior enemy, one platoon is attacked with hand grenades until the fighting strength of the platoon has reduced from 30 to just 13 men. Under the command of Lieutenant Frederick Gardner, one platoon is forced to withdraw and consolidate back with Alpha Company headquarters. 24th of April 1951, 0300 hours. Australian forces still hold Hill 504, while the US tanks continue to inflict heavy casualties. New Zealand artillery has now established new gun lines in the vicinity of Brigade HQ and is providing indirect fire support to 3 RAR. As dawn rises over the Kapyong Valley, Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson orders 3 RAR Battalion headquarters to withdraw 5 kilometres to the south so he can re-establish communications with the forward Australian company positions. In the confusion of the withdrawal, Chinese forces are able to capture 3 Australian prisoners of war, including Private Bill Madden. Although the immediate situation for Australian forces has temporarily stabilised, 3 RAR's forward company positions are now 4 kilometres inside enemy territory and supplies are running low. In the morning light, Chinese forces now become easily identifiable and are quickly targeted by artillery and tank fire, as well as the Australian forces remaining on the high ground. Between Alpha and Bravo companies, Chinese forces are highly exposed on the open rocky ground and are forced to withdraw under fire, leaving behind hundreds of casualties. 24th of April 1951, 07:15 hours. Ferguson orders Bravo Company to withdraw and consolidates closer to Alpha and Charlie companies in order to form a more defendable battalion position. 2 hours later, just as Bravo Company arrives, the order is rescinded, and Bravo Company is ordered to reoccupy its previous position. 5 Platoon leads a frontal assault back towards the vacated Bravo Company position. Chinese forces, located on a forward knoll, respond with heavy fire from machine guns, rifles and grenades. With 7 Australians wounded, including the platoon commander, 4 Platoon takes over. Under the command of Lieutenant Leonard Montgomery, a desperate bayonet charge is conducted. Close quarters combat commences. Amid fierce hand-to-hand fighting, Australian forces clear the Chinese from the knoll for the cost of 3 Australian lives and 2 wounded. By the end, 81 Chinese bodies lie on the rocky ground. However, 4 Platoon makes no further progress. Chinese forces now occupy the old Bravo Company position in strength, and Bravo Company is ordered to withdraw. Having failed to dislodge Alpha Company overnight, Chinese forces now attempt to outflank the forward Australian positions by seizing the high ground of Hill 504. Under the cover of mortar fire, Chinese infantry launch a series of relentless assaults against Delta Company's forward platoon position. Under the command of Lieutenant John Ward, 12 Platoon holds firm through the morning, killing more than 30 Chinese soldiers at the cost of only 7 wounded Australians during 6 separate attacks. New Zealand artillery plays a critical role, demonstrating superb accuracy and proving the devastating effects of artillery fire against massed infantry. However, 3 RAR is now at serious risk of encirclement, with resupply and casualty evacuation becoming increasingly difficult. Under the weight of the sustained Chinese attacks, 27th Brigade Commander Brigadier Burke orders 3 RAR to withdraw back to brigade headquarters. 24th of April 1951, 1500 hours. As Delta Company prepares to withdraw, disaster strikes. A US airstrike on Chinese forces goes wrong when a marker, fired from a spotter aircraft, lands on Delta Company's position. The first of 2 US aircraft drops napalm onto Delta Company's position, killing 2 men and causing severe burns and shrapnel wounds to several others. As the second US aircraft approaches, Captain Michael Ryan runs out of cover and, under fire, waves the marker panel to identify the Australian position. The second US pilot breaks off his attack. Still in contact, 3 RAR now withdraws. With no sleep, having endured relentless Chinese assaults through the night, Major O'Dowd now takes control of the battalion's forward company's withdrawal. Fighting a well-disciplined rearguard action and obscured by a smokescreen, the Australian companies leapfrog each other southwards. Under the cover of nightfall, 3 RAR achieves a clean break from the pursuing Chinese forces, and by 2300 hours on the 24th of April 1951, arrives at its new position along with nearly 39 Chinese prisoners of war. To the southwest, the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, is completely encircled by Chinese forces. So dire is their situation that Brigadier Burke personally flies over Hill 677 in a Douglas Dakota aircraft equipped with loudspeakers and announces, "You are on your own, cut off from any support. Fight bravely." The next day, for the cost of 10 killed and 23 wounded, the Canadians still hold Hill 677. The Patricias, with tank, artillery and air support, inflict more than 1,000 Chinese casualties. Anzac Day, 25th of April 1951. The Chinese advance down Kapyong Valley has been halted. US forces launch a counterattack, allowing the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade to withdraw in good order. The stubborn defence of Kapyong Valley by 3 RAR, along with Canadian and US forces, delays the Chinese advance by 48 hours. With the UN frontline still in general retreat, this delay, along with the Battle of River, allows UN forces to consolidate at a new defensive line further to the south. Communist forces never recapture Seoul. For the next 2 years, thousands die as the war rages on, but little territory is actually exchanged. On the 27th of July 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement is signed by North Korea, China, and the United States, but not South Korea. The Korean demilitarized zone is established, the fighting ended, the Korean War technically ongoing. As of 2024, North Korea is estimated to have an arsenal of 30 nuclear weapons. United Nations Command continues to monitor the DMZ, which remains one of the most heavily militarized international borders in the world. During the Battle of Kapyong, 3 RAR lost 32 men killed, 59 wounded, and 3 missing, taken prisoner of war. Chinese casualties may have been as high as 5,000. 3 RAR is awarded a US Distinguished Unit Citation, now known as a Presidential Unit Citation, by US President Harry Truman. The Royal Australian Regiment, which in 1951 includes 1st, 2nd and 3rd Battalions, is awarded the Kapyong Battle Honour, one of 11 awarded over the course of the Korean War. Today, the Kapyong Battle Honour is still emblazoned on the regimental colours of all 7 battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment. The Korean War, sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War, was one of the most destructive conflicts of the modern era. Today, Australian Defence Force personnel are still deployed to United Nations Command. The conflict unresolved, the Korean Peninsula nuclearised, and peace a distant prospect.